Hello and welcome to a lecture that is very much a follow-up to the previous lecture on television and video art, which was quite extensive. It attempted to give a bit of an overview of the scene in New York City in the late 60s, early 70s. And this video fills in, I think, a few details, and we'll give a few other specific examples of a time that was so important to the development of video art in general, and which, I don't know, a lot of really cool stuff was done, basically. That's what it comes down to. So there's two related parts to this video. It won't be as long as the last one. So the Vašulkas are really quite emblematic artists that worked at the time in New York, and so this lecture is going to give a bit of biographical background on them, a chronology of their work, and then it's going to individually look at Steina's work and Woody's work, because they were quite distinct. And then the second sort of component is the kitchen, which was this artist space that they initiated, which is continuing to this day in importance. So here's a photo of them from around about that time, I think. I'm guessing, I don't actually know, I'm guessing about 73 for this one. I'm sort of guessing from the equipment, but it's hard to know for sure. So Steina Vašulka was actually born in Iceland, and she studied music. She was a violinist who worked with the Iceland Symphony Orchestra. And in 1959, she found herself on a scholarship in Prague at the Prague Conservatory studying music. Woody Vašulka, who was actually born Bohuslav in a city that's now part of the Czech Republic, he trained in engineering, hydraulic mechanics, and metallurgy, it says here. But he always had an interest in the arts, and he actually studied at the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague. He was studying television and video there, more in a technical capacity, because in those days, in the 50s, there wouldn't have been any sort of art component to that. But on the side, he played jazz trumpet in a band, and he actually took on the name Woody after one of his heroes, the jazz player Woody Herman. So the two, from sort of different backgrounds, from different countries, met in Prague, and they were married in 1965 and moved to New York. Not sure why they moved to New York, but they did. They probably saw it as kind of a cool place to be at that time in the mid-60s. And at first, Steina continued with her music practice, and Woody continued with video. He worked for a company that did sort of fairly straightforward technical and recording sort of stuff. So he was basically just a recordist who did stuff. But he used the Sony Portapack system, which I referred to extensively in the last lecture, to have a portable setup that he could take to various cultural events and record them, especially music concerts. And probably his most famous contribution is he recorded Jimi Hendrix and the Band of Gypsies over New Year's 1970. I think the first night was actually New Year's Eve, and the second performance was in New Year's Day, and at the Fillmore East, the famous venue. And these were edited together into a black and white documentary that until recently anyway, was still available on DVD. So that's what he was doing. Steina didn't have any real interest in video until she went to the exhibition Television as a Creative Medium at the Howard Wise Gallery, which I also talked about quite extensively in the last lecture. So you can see how all of this stuff sort of hinges off the scene that existed at that time in New York, and the new technology, the Sony Portapack system that made portable, low-cost video recording a reality for artists. So anyway, she went to that show, and she was basically blown away by the creative possibilities of video. And so she basically said to Woody, hey, how about we get some of that gear? And he started bringing home unused equipment from the company that he worked for. Hard to say if it was with their permission or not. And they accumulated cameras and monitors and mixers and this kind of basic equipment in their own apartment in New York. And Steina began experimenting in particular with video feedback already by 1970. Of course, the first thing one does with audio or video is you fool around with feedback because it is so much fun, instant gratification, really. So they then started working with different engineers to enable, their sort of the art, the sort of stuff that they wanted to shoot. George Brown had created this keyer that did do chroma key. No, I think it only did luminescence because there was no color. Everything was black and white at the time. And Eric Siegel created a device that would overlay color then on top of the footage. So they were quite successful and created a bit of a scene, which I'll talk about later on in this lecture. But in terms of their own practice, in 1973, they had a chance to teach at the State University of New York, which has campuses in various parts of New York State. And they moved to Buffalo while keeping their apartment in New York City. And at the time, they became aware of analog audio synthesizers, and Woody bought a synthesizer that he then used to process video quite unusually. So he fed the video signal through an audio synthesizer, I mean to say, in order to change the signal, which I think proved to be quite a limitation. So in 1974, later on the same year, he bought a Rut-Etra video synthesizer and began working with engineer Don MacArthur on improvements and extra devices and so on. So in 1976, Steina received a Guggenheim Fellowship, which is one of the highest sort of arts awards that you can get in the USA. They produced a video sort of compilation for a television station. And then in 79, Woody got his own Guggenheim Fellowship, and with that money, they moved out to the desert in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1980. And their work sort of, obviously, with the new environment, took on a very different tone, much more exterior, and to do with shooting landscapes and so on that it had been previously. I'm not going to talk very much about that later work. I'm going to stick with the period under discussion, which would be the 1970s in this case, very late 60s and through the 70s. Okay, so now I'm going to just look at each of the artists individually. Though a married couple, they had their own distinct practice. And I would say Steina's practice actually got attention first. One of her first pieces drew on her orchestral repertoire and abilities with the violin. It was called Violin Power, which was less a piece than a system of development. I mean, here I've got the years 1970 to 78. So she experimented with hooking up the violin to different electronics. And in fact, the version that I've seen some footage from is actually from much later, from 1991, where she uses a MIDI violin to control the playback of a video disc. So she has pre-recorded segments on a video disc player, but the MIDI is used to trigger different parts and to repeat and kind of scratch the video. So I think it's probably influenced by turntablism and stuff like that, and Laurie Anderson and other artists who would have been working in that area. But after the initial Violin Power, she began working in a very particular way, actually. Her pieces are these mechanical constructs with motors and robotic arms and other means for moving cameras independent of a person. The cameras had no viewfinders on them. They weren't meant to be looked at by people. So she was basically constructing like these cybernetic kind of robotic systems where cameras can give us a different view than the one that we would normally perceive. And as part of this, she worked a lot with mirrors, especially curved reflectors, so that their reflection would give a very different geometrical view of the world. And here's a picture of one. So this is an important early piece called All Vision, which was installed in Buffalo, but I think also at the Kitchen in New York. It would have had its debut. And you can see that there's two video cameras mounted either side of a reflective sphere on this motorized mechanism with the monitors behind that you can watch. So if you encountered this in a gallery, there'd be lots of different points that you could engage with it, because you could certainly just look at your own reflection and that in the sphere, and then you can see how the cameras are picking that up. Because they're at opposing views, they would basically get a 360-degree view of the room, because each one is picking up a different side of this sphere and putting it onto the monitor. So you could call this immersive 3D. You could even think about it as kind of hinting towards virtual reality worlds, although I haven't really seen this piece discussed in that way, but I don't see why not now that I look at it again. So this is the kind of construct that she was creating, very intriguing video art, and I think the only counterpart would be some of Namjoon Paik's work, like the famous Buddha piece where the Buddha is watching itself. The Buddha statue sort of watches itself on television. And here is a partial list of works. I haven't found a definitive list of her works, and but these are some that I've seen discussed or mentioned. And as with many of these formative artists, it's extraordinarily difficult to actually view any of them. So before I continue on, I will flip to the Maya blog, where I have already posted Vašulka documentaries. And in this documentary, there are excerpts from numerous pieces. So it's called Binary Lives, and it's about the Vašulkas. I might sometimes say Vašulka because the first, say, several dozen times I saw their names printed, it was without the accent. And the accent in those Slavic languages is really important to change an S to an SH sound. So it sort of got ingrained. It sort of got ingrained with me that I would pronounce it one way, which turns out to be quite wrong. So I totally recommend that you get rid of all this junk. I totally recommend you watch this documentary because it's quite amusing. She talks about how she met Woody because she wanted someone who could fix her motorcycle. It's actually quite hilarious stuff. And it does have lots of really nice excerpts from her different pieces, both of them actually, both their pieces. So if I continue on, you can see some of the other experiments that were carried out. Very much in terms of overlaying different images using luminance keying. This part's super cool, where she gets to interact with herself in negative. Anyway, I urge you to watch this documentary and some of the others that I have available here if you're at all interested. There's a second one here with them a bit later in life, and so on. So yeah, work away at that stuff. And also, again, I said, the Vašulka stuff, I mean, very little of it can you actually watch. There is this excerpt here from a piece that's 50 minutes long. And it's a short excerpt which appears on a compilation. And to buy this DVD compilation, it actually costs $800. Yeah, plus shipping. So you can see why Sometimes these things end up on the internet. But I had 3 or 4 videos to post for you, which since the time I found them, maybe about a year ago, 9 months ago, and now they've disappeared. So you can see anyway, she's working with very simple constructs, but doing things that no one really thought to do before in terms of changing our perception of an environment and its geometry and our spatial relationship to things within the frame. And again, you can see quite obvious technique here of the luminance keying, so that you have one layer overprinting on another. But the interesting thing about it is how they're related in time. So that's where watching the more, I'm not sure about 50 minutes, but watching a longer video, you would see the structure unfold in time, because you could probably recognize previous footage as it was used later. And of course, quite a lot of the footage here is of the cameras themselves and the world they occupy. So I don't know, I think this is kind of like the video art that the cameras would make if they could make art about us. They'd be fixated on themselves and they'd do their selfies, you know. When I look at this, I very much think it's like the robots, not rising up against us, but rising up to make video art. I think that's kind of the beauty of what she did. So that piece is called Switch Monitor Drift with exclamation marks. It's right here, 1976. Good luck finding any others. If you do, let me know, because I'll want to watch them too. Right, so moving on to Woody Vašulka. So his concerns were quite different. There was something in common, and yes, they did work on some videos together. They worked with similar equipment, but he was far more. I mean, if Steina was external and wanted to show the world outside, he was far more internal and wanted to look at the world inside the video frame itself. So he took a very structuralist approach, which is to say he was concerned with the formal properties of material and its organization. That's basically one definition of structuralism anyway. And also about perception, but not the same way as Steina, and certainly less so about social interaction. I'm not sure very much of his stuff says anything about that. So here are 3 video selections, which are found in the documentary Vašulka Video Objects, one of a series that they made for television. And I'll just go through these briefly with some quotes. So the first object is from sometime in the 70s, and it's called number 19, E object. And Woody says that he always wanted to make an image that would be contained on the surface of a sphere, but I didn't have the instrument. So I used a scan processor to create an object, this diamond-shaped object. By scanning the room with a mirror and a camera, I imprinted the surrounding space on the surface of this object. So further below, he says the object does not need any pictorial justification. The object just exists. So again, that would be the first image here, this sort of diamond-shaped object. So it's very abstract, it's very formal, it's very structuralist. He's concerned with looking at what is the example image without really having a source at all. Like what's the image when you don't have a source? Which he expresses even more so in the third case that we'll look at here. So the second one is interesting because it kind of is different from the rest. It's called Torso, and it's about this tactility, the translation, as he says, between the feel, the touch, and the visual transformation of the texture itself. So essentially, it's a video of, I believe, himself sort of touching with his hand different parts of his body, as we can see in the center frame here, the fingers and so on. But it's been run through the Rut Etra, which does this sort of line scanning process and accentuates the texture of the scan frame itself. So we have sort of a contradiction between texture that's real, like that we can actually touch with our hands, and texture that exists only in the video frame. And because one is being converted to another in this film, in this little video demo, it sort of throws that contrast into a sharp relief. It's pretty effective, I think. And the third one here is called Time Energy Objects, and it has no content at all, you could say. So where's the quote here? These pictures are not made through the camera. They are television frames. Each of these pictures is made out of 525 lines. That means it is the television frame we are looking at, which has no information inside. It's an empty television frame. So what he's done is simply put the frame, which is normally a rectangle, of course, it's normally just the frame we're looking at on the TV, like that contains the image, and he has spun it about helically, so into a cylinder, essentially. And this creates a shape, it creates kind of a volume, a three-dimensional image out of the frame itself. So this sort of work may not appeal to everybody because it is very abstract, but Woody Vašulka was trying to get at the nitty-gritty. He was trying to get at what actually makes up video, these videos that we make. I mean, he could make a video of Jimi Hendrix playing at a club, but he could also do this sort of stuff. So he was interested in the practical and the more philosophical, if you want to call it that. I think it was philosophical, actually. And certainly this was also utilizing his engineering training, in that he was interested in material and substance for its own sake and for its own qualities. So it's interesting to apply that material training, in his case it was fluid dynamics and metallurgy, and then apply it to something less tangible like the video frame. And that's precisely what he did in these short experiments. Now I should say, I mean, the Vašulkas didn't call themselves artists. In fact, in one of the documentaries, they talk about this, and they say that you know, in the old European tradition, they would never call themselves artists because that would be presumptuous. But if others saw a value in the work in that aesthetic sense and wanted to call them artists, then they wouldn't contradict them, which I think is sort of very old school, modest approach to one's activities. Right, so here's just another, this is from a paper that I reference that goes through as a demonstration and shows sort of how a simple shape can be formed through video processing, and then a hand. Here we have the plane transformation, and then we have the line scanning, then we have an inversion, and then we have an overlay, some sort of composite of the previous two. And that's what's sort of going on here too. So it's sort of a how-to, a little recipe book for how to create these sorts of images. So here's a list of some of Woody's pieces, some of his many pieces. And also the two worked with other engineers and artists, particularly Eric Siegel. And I'd like to show you a little fragment now. So as it says, this is a video with Brian O'Reilly, who did a fair amount of work also. So that was an excerpt from Scan Processor Studies from 1973, which really seems quite contemporary in its use of noise, of audio noise, and the very direct approach to the scan processor. There is so much of this material that's hiding away and that people have on tapes and so on. I really, really hope that someone does a nice archival job and makes this available to us. But those who have seen it over the years have definitely been influenced and inspired by all of this work, including lots of artists who perform live, who do video and VJ work with recording artists, which will be the subject of our next lecture. So this ties in directly. And I think if you have any interest in this sort of stuff, the Vašulkas can certainly be inspirational in terms of material you might want to do yourself. On to the last section of the lecture. And this section concerns the space we see before us here in this image. It's called the kitchen. And we can see that there's some sort of a video installation underway and a crowd of happy people. Someone's got a mixer over there at the far left. The kitchen came about because the Vašulkas, essentially in New York City, they got to know more and more people in the art scene, and they operated kind of an open apartment where people could just drop by. But it got to the point where people were dropping by to use their video gear or do projections or chat or whatever at all hours of the day, and they actually found it hard to sleep. So they decided that they needed a new space because they didn't want to stop this engagement with other artists, but they needed a new space so that they could use their apartment for like cooking meals and resting. And they could have another space for all the art activities and socializing. So they found, they were shown a kitchen space in a disused hotel complex that was actually in a very bad state of repair. But surprisingly, they decided to take it on, and they called it the kitchen because it was a kitchen. They got funding from the New York State Council that paid the rent for a year. And again, this ties in with what I mentioned in the last lecture about the state of New York at the time increased their funding for the arts tenfold, and the amount designated for video art was $500,000, which was some crazy sum in 1970. So the Vašulkas benefited, but they immediately took the entire amount and used it to pay rent on this space so that other people could benefit, and that was part of the spirit of the times, which of course still exists among artists today, I hope. So this space opened in June of 1971, and the trick was how do they get people to show up and to actually come to this space? They started with their contacts that they had initially, quite a lot of artists they already knew. They set up a regular Wednesday night sort of open mic, though it wasn't so much an open mic as an open video screen. And they showcased all sorts of art in different combinations. It didn't really have another space at the time in New York. So there was space for music on its own, of course, concerts. There was space for experimental sound. There was space for painting. But there were dance studios. But there wasn't a place specifically for video art, for film, that would also welcome performance, dance, music, and so on. And spoken word and other things as well thrown into the mix. So that's what the kitchen offered. And on the music side, this composer, musician, Rise Chatham, became the audio curator of the kitchen when he was only 17 years old. And this really could have gone either way, but they managed to get kind of a blockbuster opener. The minimalist composer Lamont Young was releasing some new music, and they convinced him to have the album release party at the kitchen. And because he was something of a legend, the entire music scene in New York showed up for this. And so it basically put the kitchen on the map. The Village Voice and the New York Times, the two most important papers, came to review each event. They had dedicated reviewers that would do this sort of stuff. And so basically, the kitchen was the hotspot in New York for multimedia, interdisciplinary art. And so many artists came through the doors of the kitchen following this that it's not even possible to list them all. Here is a partial list, like 1% of all the artists. And if you don't recognize some of these names, then you will as you study more about the arts. It's almost a who's who of not just New York artists, but artists from other places that would have come through New York. Peter Greenaway, Brian Eno, and others from England, Michael Snow from Canada, choreographers like Lucinda Childs, composers, sort of pop music-y types like David Byrne and Talking Heads, all writers like sort of punk writers like Kathy Acker, video artists. There's Bill Viola. Everybody did something there. And it was so popular that they had to find a better space. So in 1973, they were looking around for a better venue, and they incorporated it as a non-profit, and they decided to become a bit more formal. So they formed this group called Electronic Arts Intermix with a number of people on the board so that they could establish themselves and get better funding. And it's a good thing they did move in 73 because the building they were in collapsed. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the whole building fell down one night. And in 1987, they moved again to facilities that are still occupied with other arts venues like theaters and so on. So you can visit the website, thekitchen.org. They have, in their archives, they have extensive documents. Some of them are available on the internet. You can see sort of posters and show billings through the decades, which is quite cool to check out. So the Vašulkas and the fact that they set up this space called the kitchen and the fact that they had this sort of progressive sharing attitude were such an important part of the scene and essentially helped create video art as we know it today. Of course, many of the artists at the kitchen did very different art, certainly not all like what the Vašulkas were doing, but they were enablers. They made this happen. So here's a list of some references that I used to put this presentation together. There are great articles on both of them. In particular, I mentioned this last week, but the Experimental Television Center website is very valuable for documents that you can both read online and download if you want to do further research into this in the future. There's also an institute set up here, Vašulka.org, which is actually a gallery and a space that you can visit in Czech Republic. But they have an enormous, disorganized archive online of documents. And some of those I've availed of. So things like this one that's just called Essay and is sitting on their website. I mean, I don't even know what date it was written. Some of these are handwritten or typed out documents that have been scanned in at some point. So, the archival process is still not complete. Be good work for a grad student to do sometime. But these are great sites. So between the Experimental Television Center, the kitchen, and the Vašulka website, there's quite a lot of information out there. And then all the published papers in film journals, the Millennium Film Journal here, places like After Image, also places like the journal Leonardo would be a good place to look as well. Lots of stuff. That concludes this unit. You can see this as being sort of part of the previous lecture or a continuation. I'm not sure now. This takes us basically through our week 11. So I'm giving it to you ahead of time. The PDF will be uploaded. The material, as you can see, is already there on the blog. The videos that you can watch. So I hope you avail of all of this. This is Robin signing out.